They want their own countries. The two-dimension mosto here is that the Germans, this is where the Germans start getting the idea that, hey, there needs to be a Germany. And the Italians begin to get together. There needs to be a great Italy. There's also a lot of financial reforms that they want. They want to stop all this tyranny of the bourgeois and tyranny of these factory owners. 1840s had kind of convinced them of this, that all this pushing in invisible markets and stuff, pushing to produce things, had caused a depression, as sometimes people demand things, and then when demand stops, the factory closes down, and people are out of work starving. So depression could be a killer back then. So we need some kind of financial protection for the workers. Getting back to Paris, what happened in Paris after Louis Philippe was gone, Paris goes into a republic, becomes a republic with no king. They start writing a constitution, and their constitution is about the most liberal that's come along, way beyond the American Constitution. Universal suffrage. Every man in France should get to vote, not women, but men. The right to work. If you are a healthy man, you should be allowed to work. And if a man won't hire you, the government will hire you to do work. In what are called national workshops. These workshops will open up in the morning. If you're willing to work, you come to these workshops and they will give you some work to do, and you will make enough money to feed yourself. Karl Marx is there. He comes to Paris in March of 1848, so he is there. He's witnessing this, and of course he has his book, which people are saying, that's it. You've called it. You were the predictor of all this. However, Paris it only lasts for a few months of this liberal progressive that goes on. By April, you start having a conservative backlash. A lot of the conservatives who were, kind of pushed away from government as the revolution was taking place, they began to work their way back into power. And you get the bourgeoisie who had investments in these factories that are being burned down and such, and they want stability. They want their money back, or to protect their money. So by June, they are back in power, and they shut down the national workshops, this short-lived idea of a welfare system for workers. They shut them down, and you've got all these unemployed people now in Paris who aren't going to be getting food or money for the day, and the conservatives bring the army in, and I think you know what's going to result here when you have a lot of poor people in the streets, and then here comes the army, and it's going to be blood in the streets. The bloody June days as the army clears the streets of Paris of these revolutionaries or unemployed people, and a lot of blood in the streets. And the rebels will be rounded up and either killed or imprisoned. Nasty, nasty, terrible stuff in Paris. As the revolution of 1848 winds down, the people of Paris are in barricades as the army blasts down the barricades and puts this revolution down. The Republic, however, continued. France will not get a king back, mainly because they couldn't come up with a good king. But they will have a second republic. They'll have elections. They'll try to elect a president here. And the man who wins is Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, a dark horse candidate. No one gave this guy a chance, except that it turns out that people who vote liked his name. Turns out that his uncle was the great Napoleon, so this is where he comes from. The arrival of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the nephew of the great Napoleon, is elected president for a 4-year term. And then he doesn't really do much. His nickname was the Sphinx, or people said he looked like a depressed parrot. But one people did like him was the army. They thought he would be the great Napoleon. And as it becomes clear that he's not going to win a presidential election, he is going to perform a coup d'etat, take over the government, and proclaim himself emperor. Well, if you're not going to elect me as president, then I'll just use the army to proclaim myself as Emperor Napoleon III. So here's Napoleon III, much taller than his uncle. Very strange-looking man, though. They called him the depressed parrot and didn't know what he was doing. They called him the Sphinx. Here's a cartoon of him. He will start trying to take over, creating a new empire, not in Europe, but around the world. And here's a cartoon of him trying to take over Mexico and failing. Basically, 1848, though, is a failure all the way around, except for Paris, where they did get a republic. Doesn't really sink in anywhere else. The failures of 1848, there just aren't enough workers. Just weren't enough. And so if you're a true communist, you'll say, well, this is just simply a sputter along the way, that next the revolution will be bigger. You start seeing the polarization of classes. People begin to put themselves clearly in this class or that class, either in the bourgeoisie class or the working class. And there's hatred there as blood's being spilled. The bourgeoisie will come out of this on top. They might have wanted some liberal reforms to start off with, but then the revolution scared them and they will put themselves back in power, suppressing the liberals. Maybe not falling back as far back as when the revolution started, but not going to be as far as the liberals wanted, as these liberals will become suppressed. And there is bloodshed. In pretty much all these revolutions of 1848, there's going to be violence in the streets, especially between classes. And the loser will be the workers. Workers will be gunned down as the bourgeoisie control the army. So blood in the streets. And this is where you will see the symbol of communism as the workers begin to wave this red flag, this bloody shirt, showing that someone's died, that the man, the owning class, the ruling class has no problem killing the workers. So the red flag, the red color becomes the color of communist. Let's look at what Karl Marx is doing here. Karl Marx, he's there watching this, and he is going to become the prophet. The people say, look, this guy has been predicting it. Here's a university professor for years saying this is coming. And so now communism's well known. Everyone wants to read this Communist Manifesto where this man's been predicting this. And this becomes the new religion. It is a religious belief. Marx will end up in London. He'll not be allowed to stay and foment revolution. He'll end up in London where they allow him to be there. And quite a while. So from 49 to 70, he'll live his life in London. Writing, he will continue to write. He's a prolific writer. Building his theories, working, refining them, changing them sometimes here and there. He lives in extreme poverty. If you're a true communist, here's your prophet living in poverty. He does not win Father of the Year. His 6 children will be sent away to orphanages so dad can work. And as far as any money he has, he will be supported by Engels, who will give him money to live and work on his theses and beliefs. So Marx grows old in London, working at the archives, working on his theories, doing lots of research. And he is a pretty good researcher. I mean, I'm an historian, and we do look at Marx's method of research as a new type of research, the idea of researching poor people. The next thing I want to mention is 1866. He publishes his great work, Das Kapital. This is the culmination of all of his research in a giant book called Das Kapital, the capital, the money, show me the money. This is all about money through time, a gigantic book showing how much money has existed through time and who owns this money and how property is owned. So, if you're a believer in communist revolution and you've read Communist Manifesto and you believe that this must be true, well, here's the evidence that you need. This is the evidence right there. It's all in there, so you can talk about the Communist Manifesto, and if you want more proof, well, you need to open up the big book and look at all the charts and graphs. It's in there. 1870 seems to help his cause. The Franco-Prussian War goes on. France loses this war, and a Paris Commune results. This is how popular this is, that the Paris government is going to put communism into action. The first real communist government is in the city of Paris for a short while. And then one more thing to mention, he wrote Das Kapital in German, and by 1872 it'll be translated into Russian and eventually make its way to Russia, where the Russians can start understanding and getting involved with communism. And we'll know where that's heading. So here's the title page of Das Kapital by Karl Marx, all the evidence you need to be a true believer in communism.